right. Hey, thank you so much for stopping by Brian for Liberty today. I definitely appreciate it. I hope you'll take just a second and hit like and subscribe. And if you really enjoy the content today, please share it. Trying to grow the channel, and the only way that happens is if the folks here who take it in the content share it when they enjoy it. So today we're going to be going over a couple of different things. I have been reading Thomas Sowell's amazing book, Basic Economics. I've gotten through the first few chapters of it. I think when we look at everything that's going on in the nation today and all the racial tension and a lot of focus on the inequity of outcomes in this country and the talk of systemic racism as a cause, that we got to look back at our policies and what we're doing in this country to try and create equal outcomes that may be actually exacerbating the situation. In addition to that, I've recently watched the incredible documentary on Netflix, 13th. I really enjoyed it. I felt like they did a great job of tying together the criminal exclusion in the abolition of slavery with the incredibly corrupt criminal justice system that we have right now and the for-profit prison system, and really shed a light on something that, and as a person who's read the Constitution multiple times, I can't believe that clause, that exclusion never jumped out at me sooner. So I really enjoyed it. I think it just kind of missed the mark as all this focus on race in our country today and in that documentary, which was actually a couple of years old. I think it misses the mark of the overall issues within the system, and I'm going to touch on that as well. So I hope you stick around for the whole video. And right now, let's just get going on Basic Economics. It's been an incredible read. I've really enjoyed it. I can't wait to get back into it. But I've been trying to get this video out for a couple of days, so I thought I better take a break and get this thing recorded and get it up so I can actually live up to what I said, I think, last Thursday that I was going to get this video up. I actually haven't had an opportunity to get on the internet. So anyway, who cares about that? Let's talk about the book. So as I started reading this book and I started thinking about all the things that are going on in this country and the inequality that the black community is facing in terms of economic outcomes in this nation, not just in the criminal justice system. And I read Basic Economics and I think back to all the different programs that we've enacted to try and create more accessibility to the economy as a whole, to a greater number of people. And I just look at three primary areas here, and that is housing, healthcare, and higher education. And I look at those three areas, and when you map those in regards to how their prices have increased versus the rate of regular inflation, and then you look at the government policies and how those massively rising costs cut off lower income people from the accessibility they were trying to create. We remember the 2008 housing crisis. And we know what led up to that. Unnaturally low interest rates, lending practices that we were really pushing to try and get people who were less qualified to buy a home, who maybe didn't have the best credit or work history, maybe they had slightly higher debt to income ratios, whatever the case may be, how we were trying to bend and get people into housing. And of course, everybody remembers the boom, how fast the prices went up, which obviously cuts people at the lower end out of the housing market. And everybody remembers the bust when the chickens finally came home to roost and all these poor decisions almost destroyed our economy. When I look at the analogy of housing and I put that up against healthcare and higher education, I see the exact same thing happening. And I think a lot of people do. We're trying to figure out why healthcare costs are running away and why the cost of higher education is running away. And then you have to look at how much money the government is spending into these programs in an attempt to increase accessibility, but it's really creating the exact same scenario, particularly in higher education, because you don't see the debt and the borrowing with healthcare as you do with higher education. So we look at the student loan issue right now and this crisis that we're facing, and we have to think about how we're lending that money out. We're lending 18-year-old kids tens of thousands of dollars. Now, it's obvious that they're not credit worthy to borrow that money, and it's also obvious that they can't possibly understand the long-term impacts of having that kind of debt. But we're putting this, and we're strongly encouraging all these kids to borrow money and go to college and run off and live in the dorms and have this college experience, and we're creating this malinvestment once again because they don't understand the consequences of borrowing that level of money, so they don't understand the value in terms of what they're paying for their education. So they're not necessarily making decisions that are going to put them in a position to be able to repay this debt. And they're not looking at the long-term implications of it. So now they're graduating. They're unable to find jobs that are allowing them to pay back this debt. So we have this massive delinquency building up in the student loan system. And the idea that it's not going to end essentially the same way as the housing crisis did is foolhardy. This is coming. We're already hearing the cries of forgiveness of this debt. And forgiveness of the student loan debt, please remember, is not helping the students, because they're just going to have to pay for all that in the future through higher taxes as we have to print the money to cover that cost. It's another bank bailout. The federal government has underwritten these loans, and we're looking at bailing out the banks again because we've made a poor investment again. So how does basic economics tie into this? And one of the first things that Thomas Sowell talks about in his book is the inability of humans to make the right decisions when it comes to how to properly allocate resources. And what we mean by that is economics is the tool that we utilize to try and make sense of how to best allocate scarce resources. So when we look at subsidies for higher education, for housing, for healthcare, we look at massively increasing cost. How does that play into what's going on in our country? Well, we have a disproportionate number of African Americans who are of limited economic means compared to white America. I've talked about this in the past. I've talked about the exceptional vulnerabilities that the black community would have had coming out of the Civil Rights Act, how the welfare program and other misguided things that the government tried to do actually held them back. So obviously a disproportionate number of minorities have lower economic means than whites. So it looks like a very racially unjust system. But when you look at the policies in place are actually designed to help those of lower income. They're just misguided policies. And why is that? Because we have a lack of understanding of basic economic principles, and we try and use government policy and fiscal policy to change the laws of economics, or we ignore the laws of economics as we try and implement these programs. We can't build houses as fast as we can print money. We can't build hospitals and train doctors as fast as we can print money. And we can't build new colleges and hire professors as fast as we can print money. So what we do is we're massively increasing the demand for these services, pushing their prices up artificially at a much higher pace than normal inflation. And that puts them out of reach of lower income people, which means that we have to subsidize even more to make sure that we're making these things accessible, which pushes up the debt levels, which makes students borrow more money, which makes people borrow more money than they should be for their houses, which means we have to lower lending standards. All of these things, these are all the same mistakes all over again, because we don't want to pay attention to the basic fundamental principle that resources are scarce. Because it offends us to think that a person has to make an economic decision regarding healthcare. It offends us that somebody has to make an economic decision for higher education. We don't want that person who doesn't have money for college to not be able to go to college right away. It's offensive to us that one person should be able to go into the university right out of high school and have his parents pay for everything, and another kid has to put that off and work for 4 years in order to get there. But that's the reality of the situation. You're not taking away the college from the rich kid. He's going to get it. So if you fundamentally subsidize the poor kid to enter university before he has the economic means, then you're increasing the demand and you're making it more expensive. You're forcing one child into debt at a higher rate than he would otherwise have to, because you want him to have the same outcome as somebody who is in a different financial situation. It doesn't seem fair because it's not fair, because life isn't fair. But that's the economic realities. And so when we subsidize these programs, we're trying to make scarce resources available to more people. And that's a simple supply and demand issue that just makes things more expensive and just makes things harder on people at the lower end of the economic scale. So the first 3 chapters of the book really go into this in depth. It talks about rent controls, it talks about the housing market and all of these different things. And it really just made me look at our country and say, boy, we have these disproportionately poor minorities in our country who are having trouble accessing certain services, and we're trying to solve it. But in our attempt to solve these problems, we're actually exacerbating the situation and making it worse and putting things further out of reach and creating debt-related issues. And it's just been a disaster. And we need to get the government out of our economic system. We have to start recognizing that the laws of economics can't be bent by government fiscal or monetary policy. And we just have to accept that and then work towards a way to help people out of these lower economic conditions, out of their poor economic conditions in other ways. So the first 3 chapters have just been amazing. I can't wait to get through the next 3 and talk about that next week. So again, hit the subscribe button because I'm going to be going over the next 3 chapters next week. And I look forward to having you back to hear that. So when we talk about unequal outcomes, especially in light of what's going on in the country today, the documentary 13th is incredibly poignant and really paints a picture of what happened to our criminal justice system from the end of slavery all the way through today. And it's deeply disturbing that we abolished slavery and actually made an exclusion for criminals. So if you're arrested of a crime, the abolition of slavery doesn't apply to you. And the fact that we have for-profit prisons running in this country, meaning we have corporations in this country profiting from what is essentially slave labor. That's still happening in the United States today. This really brought that to light for me. And as somebody, like I said, I've read the Constitution a couple of times, and I can't believe that exclusion never jumped out at me before. And this really brought it to light, and I think they did a really nice job with it. The place where I think it misses the mark a little is I think it focuses a little too heavily just on race as an issue. And for me, the issue with that is that the fact of the matter is too many Americans are in prison. And that, to me, is the issue. Any bad policy, any bad system is going to have a disproportionate effect on people at the lower end of the economic scale. And in the United States, people at the lower end of the economic scale are disproportionately represented by people of color. And as such, it's very easy to label it as a system that's based solely on race. I don't believe that's the case. I believe that we have allowed our state to become overly authoritarian. I think that our police have become overly aggressive, overly militarized in order to fight a misguided war on drugs, and that people of color, people at the lower end of the economic scale, are of course going to be impacted by that to a much greater degree than people at the higher end of the economic scale. So from the end of slavery through Jim Crow is a period of black history, and post Jim Crow to today is a piece of black history. So we look at the criminal justice system through that lens, from those 2 segments of time, then it's very clear to draw a straight line from this point to that point and say, see, this whole system was designed to oppress black people and keep them in prison. I don't necessarily think that's true, and I don't necessarily think that timeline is the accurate timeline to look at it. I think you look at the end of slavery right through the beginning of World War II, and then from World War II, there's a separate period to about 1970, and then from 1970, there's a third period that we look at. When I watch 13th, it doesn't break it up like that, and it ignores that period from 1940 to 1970 as unique, because from that period, those 30 years, the black community in this country made more economic strides, moved more people from poverty to the middle class, and from middle class into white collar jobs than in the 50 years since the end of the Civil Rights Act. Think about that. From 1940, Jim Crow era, to 1970, the black community in this country made more progress than they have since the end of the Civil Rights, since the signing of the Civil Rights Act. So what happened there? And to me, what happened there was, and I've talked about this in the past, in a past video in regards to the welfare state, but in the criminal justice system, we made a decision. In 1971, Richard Nixon declared a war on drugs, and he did it with the backing of Charlie Rangel, black congressman from Harlem. 2/3 of the Congressional Black Caucus supported Reagan's crime bill. Joe Biden, a Democrat, again, with the urging and encouragement of the black community and black leaders, signed a 94 crime bill. And we've seen the result of that. The result of that is that we've had a collapse in violent crime in this country and a collapse in the murder rate. It's almost half what it was in 1980 as today versus 1980. But of course, it ended up in mass incarceration as well. And when you criminalize drugs, you make them more expensive, you make it a more profitable industry, and people who are stuck at the lower end of the economic scale, coming right out of the Civil Rights Act, barely able to get their feet on the ground economically when it comes to getting on equal footing because of the systemic racism that had been in place, illicit activity is going to be more appealing. And so they got caught up in this war on drugs. So as a result of that, you have a disproportionate number of people in prison, because most of this crime, most of these people who are in prison due to drug-related offenses. The war on drugs led to mass incarceration. If you want to fix the issue, first and foremost, removing the criminality exclusion from the 13th Amendment, to me, is an absolute moral issue, because you cannot abolish slavery and have an exception to that. You're going to abolish slavery, you have to abolish it, period. That being said, it's not going to change the disproportionate number of people in prison being represented by people of color until we get rid of the war on drugs. We start excusing nonviolent offenders. We reduce the criminal code so that we can actually reduce the size of the police department, and we're just not imprisoning people at the rate that we are right now. The United States of America is 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's prison population. 1 in every 4 people locked in a cage is locked in a cage in the land of the free. That is terrible. That is disgusting. That is perverse. And I do think that there's this horrible relationship between free labor and an actual profit incentive for-profit prisons to keep these prisons full. The 13th goes really in depth into this, talks about the relationship between lobbyists and politicians, and it really gets into this in depth. But when you talk about the fact that we have not fixed the 13th Amendment yet, to me, that's just a perversion of justice. Furthermore, I look at what's going on in our country today, and I feel like we are vilifying the police. And you're seeing this call to defund the police and reduce the size of the police force and all these different things. You're seeing police walk off the job because they are not being backed by the city. You see the city of Minneapolis saying they're going to abolish their police force. And we're not learning the lessons of the past, and we need to go back and watch this documentary again to understand that if we don't change the criminal code, you can't solve the problem at the police department level. You can't start at the bottom and work your way up. And this is incredibly important. If you start with the police, the first thing you're going to have is an increase in crime. And that increase in crime is going to make people shout out for law and order. If you watch the documentary 13th, they talk about law and order as a way in which to justify and criminalize being black. I don't necessarily believe that. I don't necessarily believe that that was the plan. I know there's, Ehrlichman and what he had to say and the Southern strategy, and there's a lot of debate around those things. But the bottom line is it doesn't really matter what I believe. The outcome is what it is. That's the reality. The reality of the situation is this ended in mass incarceration of blacks, whites, and Hispanics. It just happens to be disproportionately represented by blacks. And this was a cry out for law and order. That's how it happened. If you start taking police off the street now, before you change and fix the laws, you're just going to have an increase in violent crime. If you have an increase in violent crime, you're going to have an outcry for law and order. This is going to happen 5-10 years down the road. You're going to be in a situation where you're saying, we need more police, we need more policing, we need to get these people off the streets. And we're going to forget the lesson that we should be learning right now, which is not a racial lesson, but a lesson that we can't have government doing all these things and trying to control all these different aspects of our lives, because this is where it leads us. So we have to look at maintaining our police force and then fixing the system behind it. Once that's fixed, and once we reduce the criminal code, once we stop fighting this ridiculous war on drugs and focus on treatment and therapy and rehabilitation instead of criminalization, then we can start reducing the size of the police force. But until we do A, we can't do B, because what will happen is we'll forget. We have a short memory as a nation. We'll forget. And in 10 years, you're going to have leaders in poor neighborhoods saying, we need to get more police on the street. We need to start cracking down on these criminals, and you're going to be right back here. You're going to have a second round of mass incarceration. We have an opportunity in our country to fix this right now. And the only party, as I'll say it again, the only party that's saying we need to end the war on drugs, we need to end qualified immunity, we need to end no-knock raids, is the Libertarian wing of the Republican Party and the Libertarian presidential candidate, Jo Jorgensen. So we really need to start looking at, are these two parties interested in solving this problem or not? Or are they so entrenched into the system that they are bound and determined to protect it? And right now they're just scapegoating the police as a way to get us to ignore the fact that there's a much, much bigger issue behind the scenes here, behind the police force, that's putting us in this situation. So that's what I got from 13th. That's what I got from Thomas Sowell's Basic Economics. I really hope you've enjoyed the content. Please like, subscribe, share. I will be back here in a couple of days talking about the next couple chapters of Basic Economics and hitting kind of what's going on in the news again. So I hope you'll turn on the notifications to come back and see me. If you haven't subscribed already, please do so. And thank you so much for your time. And as always, we will see you next time.